I'm going to begin with one more remark about what we're doing because it's really important. Like, as we're in the middle of a war in which crimes are being committed and people are dying and killing because of certainties about what had to happen in the past or what has to happen in the future, it's very important to understand that history is not that. History is not about predetermination. It's not about what has to be. What history can do is it can be a kind of guide to what was possible. Right? So there is a Ukrainian society and Ukrainian state today, which means that it must have been possible. The most we can do is we can guide ourselves towards a greater understanding of how such a thing was possible. But when we get to that border of how much we can understand, there always has to be room for what the people actually did, right? Not just the people today, but the people all the way back 1,000 years ago or more that we'll be talking about today. Had their choices been somewhat different, then other things also would have been somewhat different. So even as we push our understanding forward as far as it can go, we're always keeping in mind that what people do and the choices that people make are beyond our ability to predict. And that's why history is, in a way, like, it's a science. We're trying to figure things out, but it's also a humanity where we leave room for human agency. We try to understand human agency. At the same time, we know that human agency isn't this, you don't understand it with the same methods that you understand mountains and rivers. Okay, so the big idea today is how you get to a state. And that is a big idea, right? I mean, how, like, you might have noticed that whenever there's a country, whenever there's a state, there's always a legend about how it came to be. Like, for example, there's an American legend of how America came to be. This isn't my strong suit, you guys can correct me, but I think George Washington felled a cherry tree, and then 13 cherries fell, and from each of them came a colony, something like that. I don't know, but everyone has this, thank you. Okay, good. We have an American studies student here who says, yep, that's what it was. All right. But everyone has an origin story which mixes usually some element of what happened with some element of what it would be nice to think about what happened. And the reason why everybody has an origin story is that it's hard to explain how you get from no polity to apolity. And it's usually complicated, and it's best to have a story about us and them and how it's very simple, and those stories are never true. But it is authentically hard. So in this lecture today, we're going to be talking about some general causal forces which made it likely that there would be states coming into being in Eastern Europe around the year 1000. And those general causal forces are things like Christianity and what Christianity could do for people, for rulers, and for others. Secondly, the fact that Christianity was not a singularity, but Christianity was a plurality. There were two versions of Christianity that were emerging. From our point of view, a Western version and a Southern version, a Frankish version and a Byzantine version. And those two versions of Christianity, it wasn't their theological differences that mattered so much. It was that they were represented by two strong political units that were pushing outward imperially into our region, in competition with one another, And then underlying all this is the basic economic status of the place we're talking about, where nomads are still coming and going, where slavery is still very prominent. And when you think of what statehood does for people, one of the things that statehood does for people, and this is not just true in Eastern Europe, this is a sort of general characterization of what a state is, statehood protects the people that the state recognizes from being enslaved by other people. So the basic economics of the globalization that we're in at this point, circa 800, 900, 1000, is a globalization of a slave trade in which the human beings of our part of the world are being shipped at very far distances sometimes in order to be enslaved. That is a form of global economics. It persists and expands and continues well beyond our region, well beyond this time. What a state can do is put a stop to that locally. A state can say, we recognize you, we have the coercive means to make sure that you will not be sold into slavery. We also have the coercive means to tax you. So we prefer, making a very long story short, we prefer that you stay here and work the land and we tax you, rather than we capture you and sell you into slavery. And not to make you too cynical about the world, because I know you're young and naive, but the same people who do the enslaving are also often the same people who start the state. And that's going to be true in our case as well. right? The people who are doing the enslaving are also going to be the same people who, by the end of the story, are going to start the state. So there's a general story about causality here. But then there's a particular story that I want you to keep in mind too and be thinking about, which is, okay, maybe Professor Snyder is right, that Christianity, the clash of two Christianities, this economic and human issue of slavery, that these made it likely that there would be states. Fine, but why some states and not others? Why some states and not others? From the point of view of a national historiography, this question never arises, right? Your state is always inevitable. Others people's states might be questionable, but yours is always inevitable. But it's a real question. Why some states and not others? Why Kiev and Rus? Why Kiev and Rus? And here we're going to get into particularities, which involve Vikings, which involve rivers, which involve Khazars, and which also involve, and this is very important, the presence of other Slavic states. So a huge amount of politics is copying. A huge amount of politics is taking things which someone else has already done in a neighboring place and applying them yourself. So it's very important for Kiev and Rus that there was already Moravia and that there was already Bulgaria. Okay, so you remember the basic setup of where we are. We've tried to set up this period in various different ways. A Europe is being created, right? So again, Europe seems self-evident, but the difference between Europe and the classical world is that Europe is north of the Mediterranean and the classical world goes around the Mediterranean, right? So when the classical world blends into Europe is when Islam begins in the 7th century. And the line between Europe and what's not Europe then becomes a Christendom, non-Christendom sort of divide, right? There are famous, examples of when we should think of this, the 720s, when the French stop Arab armies in Poitiers, the 750s, when the Khazars stop Arab armies in the Caucasus. Those are kind of symbolic, but the basic idea is that Europe is now north of something, whereas the classical world encircled something, right? So Europe is coming into being and is coming into being as the failure of Christianity south of the Mediterranean, or the serious decline of Christianity south of the Mediterranean, and the spread of Christianity north of the Mediterranean, up into, eventually into Scandinavia around the year 1000, and into Eastern Europe around the year 1000. Remembering that these are territories, Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, which were not directly part of the classical world, right? So they're going from their own versions of paganism, which we've talked about, into Christianity. Okay, so this brings us to the question, which we're going to look at now in a little more depth, of what is Christianity at this time, right? And this is tough because, I mean, many of you will have been raised Christians or have some contact with Christianity. And the Christianity that we have in the 3rd decade of the 21st century has all kinds of varieties, and these varieties all have their traditions, some of them going back to this thing called the Reformation or the Counter-Reformation. We need to sort of clear our minds of all of that and try to think what Christianity looked like to pagans from the point of view of the 9th and 10th and 11th centuries. And to make a long story short, it's almost always true that when you convert as a ruler, you're not converting because you believe. I'm sorry. But you might believe, I'm not saying it's impossible, but you're generally converting because the religion in question is bringing something to you that your native cult does not have. Like, for example, a written language, a set of elites who can use that written language, who can be your ambassadors and your bureaucrats, like legitimacy with other states, right? So from the point of view of pagan rulers looking outward at this world, the math was working against them. What do I mean by the math? The math of slavery, okay? So if you're a pagan, everyone can enslave you. And for a while, you might say, well, I can enslave everyone else. I can enslave other pagans, I can enslave Christians, I can enslave Muslims. And so long as the power balance is on your side, that may seem like an acceptable answer. And for the Grand Duchy of Lithuania that we'll be talking about next lecture, that was an acceptable answer all the way until the 14th century. They did much more enslaving than people did enslaving of their people. They stayed pagans for a very long time. It worked for them. But what I mean by the math is that Christians are not supposed to enslave Christians. Muslims not supposed to enslave Muslims. When Christian and Muslim states fight, they'll do exchanges and so on. But so long as you're a pagan, you're fair game for everyone. And so territorially, as Christianity spreads into Europe, there are more and more of them and fewer of you, right? So every time some other state converts to Christianity, the math is getting worse for you as a pagan. There are more and more situations where you can be enslaved, and fewer situations where you're going to find it practicable to enslave other people. It's just kind of a general logic. Okay, I realize that's a strange answer to the question of what is Christianity? But what is Christianity is fundamentally a way of joining a Christian order of states in which you're not supposed to enslave the other people who are also subjects of a Christian order of state.